It's great to see you today, David.
Good to be with you, Jason.
So, David, you've been in and out of Russia for almost your whole life. When you look back at the 1990s, you certainly recall that the United States and a lot of Western leaders put huge hopes on Boris Yeltsin as being the guy who would reform the country. Now, when you look back at that, what do you think about Yeltsin? Did he try to get Russia on the right track and Putin was an unfortunate thing that occurred? Or was Yeltsin himself a bad guy and his successor, Putin, was just simply no better or continuing the legacy that Yeltsin had established?
We, our government, uh, being very bureaucratic, being very political, being in many respects staffed by people who are superficial, uh, invested heavily in the idea that Yeltsin was the embodiment of democracy. We didn't have to think about Russia. All we had to do was support Yeltsin. Yeltsin would do all the rest. In fact, Yeltsin was nothing of the kind. Yeltsin was himself a criminal. And to protect the criminal activities of his entourage and his family members, he looked for the person who would be willing to do what was necessary, which was carry out a terrorist act against Russia's own people. Well, that person was Vladimir Putin. Previous candidates, he had five. There were five prime ministers in 18 months before Putin was finally selected. Yeltsin, in a documentary film which described the process of Putin's rise to power, said that there were 20 people that he considered before settling on Putin. Putin was exactly the person that he wanted. And Putin proved himself to be very, very reliable. Before the apartment bombings took place in 1999, the entire Yeltsin entourage was in agreement that that Putin was unelectable uh, as the next Russian president, and that no one supported by Yeltsin was electable through normal means. They then began saying and working on a plan to bring Putin to power without the use of normal means, without normal means. And they said so themselves. So, what kind of person is it that not only cooperates with organized crime in St. Petersburg, treats them as his favored business partners, and basically uh, turns a blind eye, if not actively participates in innumerable contract killings? What kind of person is that to elevate to the position of head of state? Only a completely degraded political system and a political leadership would have looked to Putin and sought to put him in that position. But the most important thing is that the apartment bombings could not have taken place without Putin's cooperation. Immediately after the buildings were blown up and people were killed, it was Putin who was on television nearly nonstop, saying that, swearing bloody revenge against the people who had carried out the terrorist acts that the FSB had carried out themselves. There is to this day no evidence, not a single shred, to suggest that the Chechens had anything to do with the bombing of those buildings. 300 people killed, nearly 1,000 injured. Had the fifth unsuccessful bombing, the attempted bombing of the building in Ryazan, had it actually been accomplished, the death toll would have been well over 1,000, because there were 400 people in the building that was targeted, and a neighboring building, which would have been hit with the force of an avalanche, also had 400 people. So, through an intensive process of negative selection, the Yeltsin regime, and in fact post-Soviet Russia, turned out to, sought and found the most degraded person that they could identify to preserve their ill-gotten wealth and to preserve their power and to keep them out of prison, which would have been a normal reaction. after they lost power in any even semi-democratic country. Once he was president, Putin showed in repeated incidents that what had been placed in power was a murder machine, and that he had, in the service of his power and the power of those around him, no one's life meant anything. The lives of the sailors trapped at the bottom of the Barents Sea in the Kursk submarine meant nothing. The Russians made no serious attempt to rescue them. The children, the people who were taken hostage in the theater on Dubrovka, uh, their lives meant nothing. And in fact, the terrorist act itself was carried out by people who had just been released from Russian prisons, by an army that had established itself in Moscow, uh, under the noses of Russian security and with the cooperation of some former FSB members. After the hall was flooded with poison, with lethal gas, and many people were killed, many of the hostages, uh, the the terrorists who had carried out the operation were executed, even though they were unconscious, the better to prevent them from giving any details about how it was that this operation was organized. Same with, the Beslan school massacre. People assumed that Putin would not use force, bearing in mind that the gymnasium of the school was filled with children and their parents who were taken hostage. But they opened fire with flamethrowers and grenade launchers. The thing, we could go on and on. The shooting down of the Malaysian airliner. This is a person who is absolutely empty morally, has no moral principles whatsoever. For what the moral principles of a normal person have been substituted in his mind with a rationalization that whatever he is doing is, for the strengthening of the state. But of course, what it really means is the strengthening of clique of murderers and thieves who've taken over the state. So, the question for the West, and it's a question Ukraine has already answered for itself, is uh, do we, how far is this domination going to be allowed to extend? And how dangerous is it uh, to put in power and allow to wield nuclear weapons uh, a person and a group for whom human life has no meaning whatsoever, compared to their personal greed, which of course they rationalize and cover up, uh, uh, and their drive for power. This is what I mean, I think, if people, knew the full story, and it's important to tell the full story, there'd be no question about resistance and stopping something that's that evil. But unfortunately, the Russians have done a very good job in terms of disinforming the West. We see that in the United States right now.
So those are some interesting observations, David. But where does Russia's morality come from? A lot of people say that Russia is simply a depraved nation. But what's the origins? Where does that come from?
Russia needed, when the Soviet Union fell, it needed a kind of moral perestroika, which never took place. It needed to transform the economic structures, and it did that. But it needed to do so within the framework of the rule of law. And it and only the rule of law was capable of generating an alternative consciousness in Russia. I mean, in the Soviet period, the Soviet Union was the first country in human history to have been based on atheism. And it introduced a set of negative values, because in the vacuum that atheism created, uh, the communists deified the state. And when the state is deified, then there's no universal standard of morality that applies to the state as well. On the contrary, whoever represents the state is considered to be right by definition. This was kind of processed in people's minds and inculcated uh, as reflecting the theory of class values. In other words, morality is nothing but, right and wrong, the Ten Commandments. That's nothing but the morality of the ruling class. But the victorious proletariat, which is the class in effect of the whole people, according to their theory, has its own morality, and whatever serves that morality is in fact right and not subject to considerations of universal right and wrong, which basically is the essence of the Western tradition. Well, when the Soviet Union fell, the first thing that had to be jettisoned was this notion of class morality. And the only way to do that, to inculcate the notion in people uh, that might doesn't make right, and that there's a standard of right and wrong that is applicable to everyone, was to create the conditions for the rule of law. Well, that was never done. I mean, the so-called reformers who took over in Russia were concerned. They were not concerned. They didn't have time for the law. They didn't have time for morality. They had only time to transform the economic system. So what you got in Russia was a criminal capitalism. The rule of criminals could only be guaranteed through acts of terror. So that's where Putin came in. And under these circumstances, uh, the only thing that can really shock Russia into a reevaluation of its values, which is what the country genuinely needs, is defeat in the present war.
Well, David, as you see often enough in the United States, many people think that Russia is a conservative nation, using the American word, as if it's socially conservative and it's opposing wokeism. But as we know, that it's not what drives Vladimir Putin. How do you interpret that?
Well, this is the product of years of propaganda and disinformation. The the thing to bear in mind about Russian disinformation that many people in the West don't get is that it doesn't operate on the basis of the question at stake. For example, during the Soviet period, you had 10,000 tanks uh, uh, on the facing the border between the Warsaw Pact and NATO, and which NATO proposed to stop with anti-tank weapons for the most part. Uh, well, the anti-tank weapons were fundamentally defensive weapons, but the Russians were very keen to, or Soviets were very keen to depict NATO's efforts at self-defense as aggression against the Soviet Union. Soviet Union was being threatened by NATO's efforts to defend itself against Soviet Union's threats of aggression. Well, who's going to believe something so ridiculous? If you look at it objectively, practically no one. So the point of Russian disinformation was to make sure that those evaluating their claims would not look at them objectively, but in fact would be influenced by other factors. For example, their support of the national liberation movement in Africa or in Asia, their calls for social justice, their system of universal medical care, the fact that there was universal employment in the Soviet Union, the fact that the Soviet Union was on the side of all leftist causes. Uh, all of this was designed to induce people in the West to sympathize with the Soviet Union and to take seriously their claims about being threatened by the West. And to a certain extent, it was effective. Well, those same techniques are being used now. They're used in different ways in relation to American liberals and conservatives. In the case of the conservatives, the Russians attempt very assiduously to convince them that they are anti-woke, that this is a Christian country. We don't like gays. We don't tolerate gay marriage. We don't foster transgenderism. Uh, all of this has the same effect on our right-wing friends in the United States that the Soviet propaganda had on the left-wingers during the Soviet period. They stopped looking at the real issue. Uh, it should be obvious, of course, that the real issue is that Russia is attacking a sovereign nation that is trying to dominate it and extinguish its national identity and its democracy. That's what's obvious. That's what should be clear. But the Russians don't operate on that level. They make absurd claims. Oh, and for example, that Ukraine was getting ready to attack, that Ukraine was a threat, that NATO is a threat. But in order to make that credible, they don't argue the case. They argue, on the contrary, that Russia is a Christian nation. Why is it a Christian nation? Because Putin and his lackeys show up at church services and they wear crosses, uh, and they have FSB agents dressed up as church hierarchs. I mean, I don't know if they go to a costume store or where they get their garb, but frankly, anybody can do that. We can dress up people too as uh, religious hierarchs. Um, when Maria Butina, who served time in American prison for uh, her work as an unregistered foreign agent, came to the United States, she established contacts right away with. She claimed to be part of a group that was opposed to gun control in Russia, and she wanted to establish contact with pro-gun groups in the United States. Uh, and apparently she had some romantic relations as well with people who were in that movement. She was eventually exposed and jailed, and she's now back in Russia, making shrill pro-war statements on behalf of the government there. But the point was, you could ask yourself, well, what in the hell does gun control have to do with whether uh, Russia is justified in attacking Ukraine? Well, of course, it has nothing to do with it, and gay marriage has nothing to do with it. But all of this is used to create an atmosphere in which the implausible claims of Russian propaganda will seem plausible, and it works.
David, as you know, it's not just the right that Russia tries to manipulate, it's also those on the left. But even more, those who are so called experts in Russia are frequently manipulated and duped by the Kremlin. What have you noticed about that?
The liberals and policymakers who attended the Valdai propaganda conference, so-called the Valdai discussion group, it's simply unbelievable that those people claiming in the United States to be Russia experts flocked and allowed themselves to be stooges in that Valdai discussion group. The big reward was, of course, the ability to talk to Putin, talk to top officials firsthand, and get their disinformation from the horse's mouth. And the that atmosphere plus this a steady dose of of half-baked geopolitical analyses uh, that claim to argue for a 19th century great power dominated world had some effect on our so-called experts who then repeated this instead of getting it from publications or from sources in think tanks. So for some reason they failed to understand that what they were still getting was disinformation. It was just being delivered to them at a higher uh, political level and under circumstances in which their egos were stoked, because the Russians were adept at creating a situation in which people actually competed for the invitations to this so-called discussion club. It's just manipulation. But here's the point. I mean, uh, a country which is founded on decent values but doesn't understand what they are and takes them for granted is very vulnerable to propaganda attack by by those who are trying to undermine those values, but nonetheless are committed to their task. They haven't completely transformed the information environment, but they've definitely influenced it sufficiently that it's possible to have a discussion in the West as to whether Ukraine is deserving of support, whether there's any real issue here. That discussion should have never that should never have taken place, but it is taking place, and it's destructive, and it's threatening and harmful. And it's going to take an intellectual effort in our country uh, in order to turn it back.
David, this is really fantastic. I appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason.